You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Sitting down with Dr. Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace and also chair of the CO2 Coalition based in Washington, D.C. We talked on the phone a couple of months ago. It's good to be sitting down in person here in Alberta.
Nice to meet you, Andrew.
So you and I spoke last when you had been canceled from speaking at an event in Regina. And of course, the great irony is that the whole event had to be canceled because of everything to do with the coronavirus. And, you know, one of the things that I found interesting is that your radical proposition that I guess makes you so cancelable in the eyes of people is that you believe that CO2 is a net positive, whereas the prevailing wisdom, and you know, take from that word what you will, from all of the so-called experts, is that CO2 is destroying the planet. And how is something so fundamentally at odds with what the main narrative we hear from the alarmists, how can you deviate so radically from that and still be in a minority?
It's they who deviate. How you can think the most important molecule for life, carbon dioxide, which is where all the carbon in all life comes from, and we are a carbon-based life form, how you can think that could possibly be net negative is just beyond the pale. I mean, it's basically throwing science and logic out the window altogether.
The big talk we hear from a lot of the carbon tax proponents in Canada and other jurisdictions is that greenhouse gas emissions are the big enemy of everything, and that you have to then, to deal with that, tax it to disincentivize production of it. CO2 gets lumped in very easily by a lot of these people with the other greenhouse gases that are supposedly so harmful. So do you think that it's just CO2 that needs to be isolated from that discussion, or do you think that by and large, on all of the things that we hear referred to as greenhouse gases, we need to rethink whether they're as negative as people are saying?
Well, first, if there were no greenhouse gases, there'd be no life on the Earth. The greenhouse gas is water, of which is the most important one by far. So I don't think they're against water vapor, last time I looked, as it being some kind of poison. But water vapor and clouds and ice control the climate so much more than anything else. If it were not for the greenhouse gases, the Earth would be 33 Celsius colder, and life could not be here. So the greenhouse gases are necessary for life, and CO2 is necessary as a food for life. They're two completely different things. CO2 is also a greenhouse gas, as well as being the primary food for all life. But the most important point is there is no historical evidence that CO2 causes the temperature of the Earth to change in any way. None whatsoever. You can look at the historical evidence in the glacial periods. You can look at the historical evidence back 500 million years ago. And the ice ages, for example, when the Earth gets cold, have nothing to do with the CO2 levels. Sometimes there's an ice age when CO2 is very high, sometimes there's one when it's very low, and vice versa. Sometimes they go in completely opposite directions for tens of millions of years. While CO2 goes up, temperature goes down, and while CO2 goes down, then temperature goes up. This is in the historical record. The only evidence that CO2 causes warming is in computer models that are built to say it does. People don't realize that computer models are not a crystal ball that can predict the future. There is no such thing as a crystal ball. Is a mythical object, like reading your palm, right? And trying to tell the future by reading your palm. A computer model, you put your assumptions in it, and what your assumptions are come out the other end of it. It's based on what you assumed was the correct number. And they just assume that CO2 will cause warming, so they put that in the computer, and of course the computer shows warming. But just because CO2 is going up now and temperature is going up now in this modern warm period does not mean there is a cause-effect relationship between the two. And the only times there seems to be a cause-effect relationship between the two is when temperature drives CO2, not the other way around. When the ocean's warm, CO2 comes out of it. When the ocean's cool, CO2 goes into it, changing the amount of atmosphere there is, CO2 there is in the atmosphere. But it isn't what's changing the temperature. The temperature is being changed on cycles that are with the Milankovitch cycle, which is solar cycles, solar and Earth tilt cycles. It's right right there for anyone to see. But these people don't want to know anything that happened before 1850. Like for them, that's when the life began and the earth began or whatever. That's the only years they're really interested in. They deny that the medieval warm period existed. They deny that the Roman warm period existed, but they did exist. And they just ignore the Holocene. This is the interglacial, is called the Holocene right now. It's 10,000, 11,000 years long. The first half of it was warmer than it is now. That was called the Holocene climatic optimum. And everybody who studies climate knows that's there, that it was warmer then. The Sahara was actually green. There were goat and cattle herders all across the whole Sahara up until about 6,000 years ago, when it suddenly broke, the Sahara dried out, and since then it's been getting colder. But it's been getting colder, but we're in a little warm blip now. But before that, it was the Little Ice Age. Then it was here, then it was there, then it was here, then it was there, then it was here, then it was there. So that's going backwards. It's been cooling for 6,000 years, and that's all in the Greenland ice cores. Anybody can see it.
So your position is not that the warming isn't happening, which is, I think, another position that you hear from some of your colleagues that are classed as deniers by people. You're saying that the warming is not anthropogenic, it's not man-made, and that it's also not all that atypical.
It certainly is not atypical at all. Even during this last 10,000 years, there's been periods of warming and cooling that have been more rapid than this 1 degree in 300 years. That's all it is, you know. It's 1 degree Celsius in 300 years since the peak of the Little Ice Age, 300 years ago. That is what has happened, slight warming. We would have expected that because it was in the same cycle as from the Roman warm period into the Dark Ages cold period into the medieval warm period 1,000 years ago into the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age peaked in 1700 and now we're in the modern warm period. So we would have been expecting a warming. Those other cycles had nothing to do with CO2 because it stayed the same the whole time, 280 ppm. We've raised it up to 415 and it hasn't changed the rate of warming at all. The rate of warming is 1 degree per 300 years, which is like the United Nations is predicting amounts up to 5 times or more than that to occur. But again, those are all based on computer models, not on real measurements. You can't measure the future yet. That's the problem. And people are acting as though you can know what the temperature is going to be in 80 years from now.
Well, and also with great precision about, you know, we've all heard the cataclysmic predictions that we've got 12 years left, basically, and all of these sorts of things. But it's not just that things are getting worse that these people say. It's that they know with certainty. And the flip side, though, I think is almost more dangerous, which is, well, it's a possibility, so shouldn't we prepare for it? And then they use that as a justification for all sorts of dangerous economic policies and other public policies. So
yeah, well, we should prepare for an invasion by Martians.
Well, but to your point that you can't predict the future, how do you push back against these people that say it's a possibility? Because that's almost more dangerous than the people that are claiming it's a certainty, the ones that say, well, it may or may not happen, but these are all the things we should do anyway.
Well, you don't spend half of civilization's wealth on something that might not be true. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to wait before you do that. We didn't prepare for the virus before it happened. I mean, we have health agencies and stuff, but you can't do anything about something until it happens. And nothing is happening right now. Mm-hmm. The weather is happening, just like it always has. So people are trying to make out as if there's unusual things happening now. There aren't. Even the United Nations IPCC says there is no increase in drought, flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, or tornadoes. It's normal. And some of them are actually declining. And in a warming world, we would actually expect hurricanes to decline because they depend on the difference in temperature between tropical air and temperate air in the north. It's where those air masses meet. That's why you don't have hurricanes on the equator, because the air is all hot there. Mm. But where the cold air and the warm air meet is where these cyclones are formed. And that should go down as the temperature, when the Earth warms, it warms inadvertently towards the poles. It doesn't really change at the equator any significant amount. And that's how they can get away with, saying Canada is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Because the whole northern hemisphere is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world, maybe 1.5 degrees instead of 0.5 at the equator. You know, it's always that way when the Earth warms and cools. It does so inadvertently towards the poles. That's why they're so cold and the equator is still so warm. But when the Earth warms into the greenhouse ages, which are when the Earth is warm everywhere, there were forests on Canada's there were tropical forests at one time on Canada's Arctic islands. And then as the world cooled over the last 50,000 years, we're at the tail end of a 50,000 year cooling. I've got to get my numbers right. We're at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period today. 50 million years ago was the Eocene thermal maximum, and it has been cooling in fits and starts over that whole 50 million period until we get to the glaciation we're in now, the Pleistocene Ice Age. We are still in the Pleistocene Ice Age. It is not over. People think the last glaciation was the end of the Ice Age. That was just one of about 45 glaciations that have come and gone during the Pleistocene Ice Age, where the temperature has sunk to lower than it has been in the last 250 million years since the last Ice Age, which was the Karoo, which ended 250 million years ago after 100 million years. That Ice Age lasted 100 million years. We know that, it's true. You never hear these people talking about what the real climate change that's happened on this Earth, from Ice Age to Greenhouse Age back to Ice Age again, over a 350 million year period. Those are the real changes in climate. What we're in now is nothing. This is just normal weather in a Holocene interglacial period, of which there have been 45. And they've all been on the cycles of the Earth's tilt or the cycles of the Earth's orbit. We know that for sure.
You said earlier on that all of the climate researchers know this stuff. They all know about the cycles, they know about the history, they know about the trajectories you've described here. Are they just ideologues? They're so hell-bent on this alarmist narrative that they're kind of overlooking things that are fully within the realm of their research and all of that? Or is it just about the money? And I've heard that argument that, there's no grant funding for proving a negative, but there's lots for proving that it's a problem. Is it just about the money, or do you think there is an ideological thing that's sweeping?
Well, there is ideology involved. Nobody would say the world is going to end in 12 years if it wasn't kind of like a religious cult, right? It isn't going. What does the world ending look like anyways? Is it going to blow up?
Is it melting? Is it all the water dries up?
No, nothing like that's going to happen, and it's just silly, actually. It's childish to say the world is going to end in 12 years, or even 1,200 years. I mean, it is not going to end anytime soon. It's been here for 4.5 billion years, and life started 3.5 billion years ago, and 500 million years ago, modern life emerged. And we are now at the highest biodiversity the planet has ever been. Biodiversity has simply increased every time, even when there's an extinction, it comes back more biodiverse than it was before. And National Geographic published that graph in 1999, February 1999. They published the graph of global biodiversity, and it shows it higher now than it's ever been in the history of life. And we're told that half the species are going extinct any day now.
Well, we hear this about wildfires as well, where every time there's a wildfire, it always comes back with a lot more vibrance.
They say, yes.
Yes.
The wildfires in the U.S. were so much more extensive in around 1900 to 1930. That's when people started managing for wildfire prevention. And the reason they've been rising in the last 20 years is because urban greens have got control over the management of rural forests. And the foresters are no longer managing them. And also because they're building their houses in coniferous forests on either side, 120-foot trees of needle trees, which are pitchy. And when their crowns catch fire, that's the end of it. The wind just takes them 100 miles an hour, and nothing can outrun that. And all their houses burn down. That's just stupid planning. But the fact is, in the United States, where there's a lot of public forest and a lot of private forest, the private forests almost never burn. The public forests burn because they're mismanaged.
So we're told by a lot of the, again, I keep going back to so-called experts, I don't know what else we can describe them as that's not terribly unflattering, that everything is a symptom of climate change. Wildfires are climate change, cold weather, warm weather, droughts, everything is climate change. And how do you push back against that narrative when it seems like there's not a single piece of evidence that would ever refute what they believe? Because they view everything, they weave it into that overarching narrative. So I know you've been very frustrated by this because you've been talking about these things for decades now. How do you think we need to?
The climate has hardly changed. They're talking about the future, that's going to be dramatic changes in the climate. You know, climate, the official definition of climate is the average weather over the last 30 years. So it's a moving average, right? And if you take the climate of this Earth, all it's done for the last 300 years is get a little bit warmer. You know, and a lot less people are freezing to death than did back then. 20 times as many people die from the cold as die from the warmth. The only climate refugees in this world are people flying south from the winters in the north.
Yeah, no one from Florida is spending their summers in Canada or their winters in Canada.
No, they're not. Well, they might come here in the summer because it can long nights and long days and sunny weather. It's a nice time to come to Canada. That's when most people do come to Canada. But they don't come here in the winter, except the people who come skiing. They'll come here in the winter because that's fun to do in the snow, and they might not have any snow in their country. But the bulk of people who are going to another place are people going from cold places to warm places.
When you're a climate refugee yourself, because you moved from BC to Mexico, did you not?
Well, we have a place there, yes.
Yeah, so
and we go there in the winter.
But if you were from Mexico, you probably wouldn't have a winter home in, you know, northern Alberta or something.
No, not likely.
And why then do we hear this rhetoric from, you know, the Liberal government in Canada, for example, about climate refugees from Africa? I mean, again, I have no frame of reference, having never been there, not being an expert on this, but you know, we're told the portrait is a very grim one, that you've got communities that can't grow food, that don't have water, all because of climate change.
It's all lies. They're coming here because they want to come to a better country that's got a higher standard of living and better education, better health care, and all that. One of the reasons the people in Africa are still in such a dire strait is we won't let them use fossil fuels to make electricity. We won't help them. That's why China...
We're imposing our environmental virtue signaling on African nations.
Yes. Meanwhile, we use a lot more fossil fuels than they do. But that is why China is expanding its influence so much into Africa and South America, is because they will build the coal plants and then take 10% interest on the revenue from them, just like any business would do. But then the people have electricity and can build their society up. There's also still, of course, a lot of tribalism in Africa. It's nascent there, and I've been through lots of sub-Saharan Africa, and it's pretty tough in parts. I think we should be doing more to encourage them to develop a decent energy infrastructure, because that is definitely the basis of a large part of our standard of living, is the fact that we have electricity and fuel, the energy to run our system with. And I think, you know, a lot of the climate alarmists, the real climate alarmists like Al Gore, who isn't a scientist, and the people, there's so many of them that aren't scientists who are the leaders of the alarmism. Then the scientists who are alarmists are like Michael Mann. He is actually a complete fraud. I mean, he denies the history of science. He projects these horrible future scenarios, and he basically assassinates the character of everybody around him. I mean, if you and Google's in on it, and all Facebook's in on it, Twitter's in on it. If you Google me, you will find that all the character assassination websites come first. Not what I've done in my life, not who I am, or, you know, all of the things.
But all of the denunciations from Greenpeace.
Yes, and it's just character assassination. Yes. It's that I'm in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry and I work for polluting industries. Like, they use the term polluting industry. They say the word industry like it's a swear word, like he works for industry.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, when you talk about investment in Africa and infrastructure and anywhere in the world, it's very difficult when the alarmists view industry itself as the enemy.
Yes.
They view true progress as being the enemy.
Yeah, and actually, where are things made? By industry, right? And science used to be actually more done by the private sector, and when the private sector invests in science, they actually expect something useful might come out of it. Well, actually, something useful does come out of the government-funded science: fear. Fear of the future and fear of the climate. So that helps the politicians. And one of my hypotheses, and I'm writing a book that will include this, I think this is a really important insight in many ways, in that nearly all the scare stories today are about things that are invisible, like CO2. Like, you can't point over there and say, look what the CO2 is doing over there. Or so remote that nobody can go and observe them for themselves. So because you can't observe it directly yourself, which is the first basis of science, is observation. seeing something happen and saying, oh, maybe this is causing this, and then doing an experiment to verify whether or not there is a cause-effect relationship there, and then giving it out to be replicated by independent people, other people than you. So then pretty soon you've got a hypothesis that's turning into a theory. But you can't do that with things that are invisible very easily. So if you're basing your story on something that is invisible, you depend on the activists, the media, the politicians, and the scientists, all of whom have lots of skin in that game. You depend on them to tell you what's really happening. So when they tell you that CO2 is causing this or that or the other, you can't see it. You have to believe them.
And then you expand that to the media and, as you were saying, the tech companies.
Yes, and the tech companies and the politicians who want scare stories that they can tell their voters they're going to save them and their children from. You know, you're driving down the highway in your SUV, you're afraid you're killing your children and your grandchildren, right? So you get guilty about that. And then you send a big check to Greenpeace or one of these other so-called charities that are going to save the world for you. That's how that works. They are very good at getting their hands in other people's pockets and extracting money from them, like up to $500 million going into Greenpeace and these other groups.
So you still do this. You still talk about these issues. You still write about them. Is there still a bit of hope or optimism that you have?
Well, the reason I'm writing the book I'm writing now is so that it's there as a record of what I believed at this time in history. And I think it will bear out. As a matter of fact, I know it will. The scare, for example, about GMOs, genetically modified foods. Yeah. Have they ever shown you what it is that's in there that is harmful?
No.
Under a microscope?
I'm told I have to be against them, but
yes.
No one's told me why. Well,
it's because it's invisible, right? Radiation is invisible, so they can make up all kinds of scare stories about it. Those are and pesticide residues in food are invisible, so that gives the organic people, which in the sense of food, the word organic is strictly a marketing term. It has no scientific basis to it whatsoever. Organic in chemistry means the chemistry of carbon, which is all food pretty much, because all the food is from living things that are based on carbon. So all our food is organic in that sense, except maybe salt.
Beyond meat burgers.
Well, they're organic, yeah, no matter what they've got in them. The other things, though, are almost all caused by CO2. They say that the coral reefs are dying from CO2. How many people can go and see if CO2 is killing the coral reefs? First, you can't see the CO2. Secondly, the coral reefs are underwater, right? And not that many people go there. So the scientists who are studying the coral reefs and making the headlines, 93% of the coral reefs are dying, 93% of the coral reefs are nearly dead, 93% of the coral reefs are terminal. None of those things are dead. Right? Dying, nearly dead, and terminal are not dead, right? So they can get away with saying that, because if someone goes there and say, well, they're not dead, they can say, well, we didn't really say they were dead.
We said they were almost there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, my wife and I moved into a house and we inherited a garden, not having any ability to do any gardening. And there are lots of flowers there that don't look all that good, but that does not mean that the garden is dead. It doesn't mean it's over. There's a cycle to these things.
Yes.
They grow, they go away.
Everything dies. That's what people don't seem to get. There's nothing that doesn't die, doesn't have an end of life, right? And then a new one is born, hopefully, usually. And coral reefs are no different. Parts of them die all the time. And sometimes hurricanes smash them up. Sometimes boats run into them and damage them. Sometimes people overfish them. And so it's not that there's no issues with reefs, but reefs are thriving all around the world where reefs can grow. And the proof of this thing about them dying because of the seas are too hot, the richest coral reefs in the world, with the most reef fish too, the most biodiversity of corals and reef fish, is in the warmest oceans of the world, which is the Indonesian Archipelago Sea, which is a shallow sea. It's year-round, it's the warmest ocean in the world, and it has the highest biodiversity. It is actually a kind of sanctuary. As the world has cooled over the last 50 million years, the range of corals has shrunk into a much smaller space near the equator than it was when the world was hot. That's just it. So really, yes, it's cold that has reduced the area of coral, not heat.
Well, glad we can have you here to break through a lot of the noise on this. We've talked about the sea, the air, the land. I think we've pretty much covered all the bases. We'll get you on space next time. Patrick Moore, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.